Jake Martinez sat in the back row of the xenobiology classroom and watched his alien classmates whisper to each other. The Galactic Academy was full of strange beings from across the known galaxy, but Jake had grown used to being the only human. And most of his classes? His brown hair and simple Earth clothes made him stand out among the colorful alien students who filled the room. The classroom buzzed with nervous energy as Professor Velth entered through the main doors. The professor was a tall crystalline being from Zarian Prime whose body caught the light and threw rainbow patterns on the walls. His voice sounded like wind chimes when he spoke, and today he seemed more excited than usual. Professor Velth moved to the front of the class and raised one of his crystal arms for attention. The room fell quiet except for the soft humming sounds that some of the mollusk students made when they were nervous. Jake noticed that even the peaceful Zephyrians with their soft blue skin looked worried about something. "Students, I have an important announcement today," Professor Velth said, and his voice echoed slightly in the large room. "We will be joined by a very special new student. This is the first time in Academy history that we have welcomed a member of the Vortex species to our xenobiology program." A collective gasp went through the classroom. Jake saw several of the herbivorous Kaleri students move their chairs further away from the center aisle. Their leaf-green skin had turned a pale yellow color, which Jake had learned meant they were scared. The mollusk students stopped their humming completely and pulled their soft bodies deeper into their protective shells. Jake had heard about the Vorthak during his orientation classes. They were known throughout the galaxy as fearsome predators, who hunted with razor-sharp claws and powerful jaws. Most species considered them dangerous and avoided their home systems whenever possible. Jake wondered why one would want to study xenobiology at a peaceful academy. The classroom doors hissed open and the new student entered. Even Jake felt a moment of surprise at the sight of the massive alien who walked through the doorway. The Vorthak stood nearly 8 feet tall with dark scales that gleamed under the artificial lighting. His yellow eyes swept across the room with the focused attention of a natural hunter. Thick muscles rippled under his scaled skin as he moved, and Jake could see the tips of retracted claws at the ends of his fingers. "Class, please welcome Kresh," Professor Velth announced as the large predator made his way down the aisle. "He comes to us from the Vorth system and has shown exceptional promise in biological sciences." Kresh moved with surprising grace for such a large being. His footsteps were quiet on the metal floor, and he kept his claws fully retracted. When he passed by the nervous herbivorous students, he made sure to give them extra space and kept his movements slow and non-threatening. Jake noticed that despite his fearsome appearance, the Vorthak seemed to be trying very hard not to scare his new classmates. Several students had already moved to different seats by the time Kresh reached the middle of the classroom. Amy Collins, a Kaleri exchange student with bright green skin, had moved 3 rows away from where Kresh chose to sit. Her large eyes kept darting between the Vorthak and the exits as if she was planning an escape route. Jake remained in his back corner seat and continued to observe. He found it interesting that while everyone was focused on the obvious predator in the room, none of them seemed to notice that Earth was also classified as a death world. Most aliens assumed that the dangerous classification came from harsh weather or poisonous plants rather than the hunting abilities of its dominant species. Professor Velth cleared his throat with a sound like breaking glass. "Now that we are all here, let us begin today's lesson on ecosystem dynamics. We will be studying how different species interact on various types of planets." The lesson proceeded with Professor Velth explaining how herbivorous species created stable ecosystems through careful plant management and symbiotic relationships. He showed holographic displays of peaceful worlds where different species work together to maintain balance without violence or predation. Throughout the lecture, Jake noticed that his classmates kept stealing glances at Kresh, the big Vorthak, listened carefully, and took detailed notes with a writing implement that looked tiny in his massive hands. When Professor Velth asked questions about plant-based ecosystems, Kresh raised his hand politely and gave thoughtful answers that showed deep understanding of biological principles. "Excellent point, Kresh," Professor Velth said after the Vorthak explained how removing certain predator species could cause plant populations to grow out of control. Your perspective on predator-prey relationships adds valuable insight to our discussion. Amy Collins made a small sound of disgust and muttered something under her breath about carnivores not understanding true harmony. Several other herbivorous students nodded in agreement. Jake noticed that they all seemed to assume that having a predatory diet automatically made someone violent or destructive. As the class continued, Jake found himself thinking about the irony of the situation. Here was Kresh trying his best to be gentle and non-threatening, while the herbivorous students feared him simply because of what he was. Meanwhile, Jake sat ignored in the back of the room, even though humans had arguably become the most successful persistence hunters in galactic history. When Professor Velth dismissed the class, Jake watched as students quickly gathered their belongings and hurried toward the exits. Most gave Kresh a wide berth as they passed him. The big Vorthek packed his materials slowly and carefully, making sure not to make any sudden movements that might startle the remaining students. Jake decided to approach the new student. He walked over to where Kresh was organizing his notes and waited for the alien to notice him. When the yellow eyes looked up, Jake saw intelligence and kindness rather than the savage hunger that most species expected from a Vorthek. "Welcome to the Academy," Jake said simply. "I am Jake Martinez from Earth." Kresh tilted his massive head and studied Jake for a moment. "Thank you, Jake Martinez from Earth. I am pleased to meet you. Your planet has quite a reputation as a death world." Jake smiled. "So does yours." For the first time since entering the classroom, Kresh showed what might have been amusement. "Yes, it does. Perhaps we understand each other better than most." As they walked toward the exit together, Jake reflected on how appearances could be deceiving. The most feared student in the class seemed to be the most thoughtful one, while the herbivorous majority had already decided they knew everything they needed to know about both predatory species in their classroom. The real education was just beginning. 3 weeks passed since Kresh joined the xenobiology class, and the daily routine had settled into predictable patterns. Jake continued to sit in his back corner while Kresh chose a seat in the middle section where he could see the professor clearly. The herbivorous students had created an invisible barrier around the Vorthek, maintaining at least 2 empty seats between themselves and the large predator. Jake watched with growing interest as Kresh proved to be nothing like what the other students expected. During group discussions, the massive alien spoke in soft tones and always waited for others to finish before adding his thoughts. When handling delicate equipment for lab work, Kresh moved with careful precision and kept his claws fully retracted. He even brought extra writing materials to share when other students forgot their supplies. Despite these obvious signs of gentleness, the herbivorous students continued to treat Kresh with suspicion and fear. Amy Collins had become the unofficial spokesperson for their concerns, and she made sure everyone knew how uncomfortable she felt having a carnivore in their peaceful learning environment. "I just do not understand why predators need to study biology," Amy said during lunch break while sitting with a group of Kaleri students. "They only care about hunting and killing. How can they appreciate the beauty of symbiotic relationships when destruction is all they know?" Jake overheard this conversation from a nearby table where he ate alone as usual. He noticed that none of the herbivorous students ever included him in their discussions about the dangers of having carnivores in class. They seemed to forget that Earth was classified as a death world, or assume that humans were somehow different from other predatory species. The irony was not lost on Jake. While his classmates feared Kresh because of his obvious physical adaptations for hunting, they completely ignored the fact that humans had evolved as persistence hunters. Earth had produced one of the most successful predatory species in known galactic history, but most aliens dismissed humans as primitive or harmless. Professor Velth announced that the class would take a field trip to the Academy's massive Biodome complex. The artificial environment contained recreations of dozens of different planetary ecosystems from across the galaxy. Students would spend the day observing how various species interacted in their natural habitats. The Biodome was impressive even by galactic standards. Massive transparent walls curved overhead, creating the illusion of being outdoors under an alien sky. Different sections recreated the environmental conditions of peaceful herbivorous worlds, where multiple species lived in harmony without predation or violence. Jake found himself walking near Kresh as they entered the first ecosystem display. The Vorthek moved with his usual careful grace and kept his voice low when making observations about the animals they saw. His knowledge of predator-prey relationships was clearly extensive, but he explained concepts in ways that did not frighten the herbivorous students. On my homeworld, Kresh said while observing a group of small grazing animals, we understand that hunters and hunted are both necessary for healthy ecosystems. The predator shapes the behavior and population of prey species while the prey provides sustenance for the predator. Neither can exist without the other. Amy Collins, who had been standing several meters away, made a sound of disgust. That is exactly what I mean, she said loudly enough for the whole group to hear. Carnivores always try to justify their violent nature by claiming it serves some greater purpose. You cannot understand true biological harmony when you only see other living beings as potential food. Several other herbivorous students murmured agreement with Amy's statement. Jake noticed that they all seemed to believe that having a plant-based diet automatically made someone more enlightened or peaceful than carnivorous species. Kresh did not respond to Amy's criticism, but Jake could see the hurt in the big alien's yellow eyes. The Vorthak had been trying so hard to fit in and show that he was not the monster that others expected him to be. Jake felt a growing sense of kinship with the misunderstood predator. As they moved through different sections of the biodome, Jake began to share his own observations about ecosystem balance. He talked about how removing predators from an environment often led to overgrazing and habitat destruction as prey populations grew beyond sustainable levels. He explained how hunters actually helped maintain genetic diversity by removing weak or sick individuals from breeding populations. Those are interesting points, Jake, Professor Velth said after. Jake finished explaining how wolves had restored balance to Yellowstone National Park. Earth ecosystems seem to rely heavily on predator-prey relationships for stability. Amy Collins looked annoyed that anyone was supporting predatory behavior. But surely there are better ways to maintain balance than through violence and death, she argued. Advanced civilizations should be able to find peaceful solutions to overpopulation problems. Jake considered how to respond to this without revealing too much about human hunting heritage. Nature does not really care about our opinions on what is peaceful or violent, he said carefully. Evolution shapes species to survive in their environments. Predators evolved to hunt because that strategy worked for millions of years. Easy words from another Deathworlder, Amy replied dismissively. I suppose you support Kresh's violent perspective because your own planet is known for being dangerous. Jake felt a flash of irritation at Amy's casual dismissal but kept his voice calm. Earth is dangerous because of environmental factors like weather and geological activity, he said. Most aliens assume that Deathworld classification comes from external threats rather than the species that evolved there. This was not entirely true, but Jake was not ready to reveal the full extent of human predatory adaptations. He noticed that Kresh was watching him with what might have been understanding in his large yellow eyes. The field trip continued with Professor Velth showing them examples of different hunting strategies used by various predator species. They saw ambush hunters who relied on camouflage and surprise attacks. They observed pack hunters who used coordination and teamwork to take down larger prey. They studied venomous species that used chemical weapons to paralyze their victims. Each example drew gasps of horror from the herbivorous students, who viewed these adaptations as proof that carnivores were inherently violent and destructive. Jake found their reactions amusing since most of them came from species that had evolved sophisticated chemical defenses or other survival mechanisms that could be just as deadly when necessary. The day ended. Jake walked with Kresh toward the transport station. The big Vorthak had been quiet during the latter part of the field trip, and Jake could tell that Amy's words had affected him more than he wanted to admit. Do not let them get to you, Jake said as they waited for their transport. Fear makes people say stupid things. They judge you based on what you look like rather than who you are. Kresh turned his massive head to look at Jake. You speak with wisdom for someone so young, the Vorthak said. Your species must understand something about being misunderstood. Jake smiled grimly. More than you might think. As their transport arrived, Jake reflected on the day's events. His classmates continued to fear the obvious predator while completely ignoring the persistence hunter sitting right next to them. Eventually, they would learn that assumptions about dangerous species could be very wrong, but Jake suspected that lesson would come in a way none of them expected. 2 more weeks passed, and the xenobiology class had fallen into a comfortable routine despite the underlying tensions. Kresh continued to prove himself as a thoughtful and gentle student, while the herbivorous aliens maintained their careful distance. Jake remained largely invisible to his classmates, who seemed to have categorized him as just another harmless Deathworlder. Professor Velf announced that today's lesson would focus on extreme hunting adaptations found across the galaxy. The crystalline being projected a holographic display showing various predatory species and their specialized techniques for capturing prey. Jake noticed increased fidgeting among the herbivorous students as they prepared to learn about subjects that made them deeply uncomfortable. Predation has driven some of the most remarkable evolutionary adaptations we see in nature, Professor Velf explained as images of different hunters appeared in the air above his desk. Today we will examine how various species have developed unique strategies for survival in competitive environments. The first examples were familiar to most students. Professor Velf showed the lightning-fast strike of a Zentari viper, which could extend its neck 3 times its normal length to catch prey. The herbivorous students gasped as they watched slow-motion footage of the attack happening faster than most eyes could follow. Next came the phantom stalkers of Kepler-7, who could bend light around their bodies to become nearly invisible. The demonstration showed what appeared to be empty ground suddenly erupting as a large predator materialized to capture an unsuspecting herbivore. Several Kaleri students made distressed sounds, and Amy Collins covered her eyes during the replay. Professor Velf continued with examples of pack hunters from the Rigel system who used complex communication to coordinate attacks on prey much larger than themselves. The footage showed dozens of small predators working together with military precision to bring down massive herbivores that could have easily crushed any individual hunter. As we can see, Professor Velf said as the images faded, successful predators have evolved remarkable specializations. Speed, surprise, coordination, and overwhelming force are common themes across many hunting species. Jake listened with interest while noting that all the examples focused on quick, decisive hunts. Every predator species shown relied on ending the chase as rapidly as possible through superior physical abilities or tactical advantages. None of the hunting strategies involved extended pursuit or wearing down prey through attrition. Professor Velf looked toward Kresh with his crystal features reflecting the classroom lights. Since we have a Vorthik student with us today, perhaps Kresh would be willing to share some insights about hunting practices from his homeworld. Kresh stood slowly and moved to the front of the classroom with his usual careful grace. Despite weeks of peaceful behavior, his massive frame and predatory features still caused visible nervousness among the herbivorous students. Amy Collins and several other Kaleri had unconsciously leaned away from him as he passed their seats. "Thank you, Professor Velf," Kresh said in his deep but gentle voice. Vorthak hunting practices focus on precision and respect for prey animals. We are what you might call ambush hunters who rely on strength and speed for quick, clean kills. Kresh activated the holographic display and showed images of his homeworld. The landscape was rocky and mountainous with plenty of natural hiding places. Large herbivorous animals grazed in valleys while predators waited patiently among the stone formations. Above, a Vorthik hunt begins with careful observation, Kresh explained as the display showed a hunting scene. We study our chosen prey for hours or sometimes days to understand their patterns and habits. When the moment is right, we strike with maximum force to ensure death comes quickly and without unnecessary suffering. The hologram showed a Vorthak leaping from concealment and taking down a large herbivore with a single powerful blow. The entire sequence lasted less than 5 seconds from initial movement to final conclusion. Jake noticed that several students looked impressed despite their fear of the massive alien explaining the process. The key to Vorthak hunting is patience and overwhelming force, Kresh continued. We never chase prey across long distances because that would be inefficient and cruel. If our initial attack fails, we typically abandon the hunt rather than pursue. A wounded animal. Amy Collins raised her hand with obvious reluctance. What happens when prey animals run away before you can attack them? She asked. Surely most creatures are too fast for even Vorthak to catch in open terrain. Kresh tilted his large head thoughtfully. That is an excellent question, Amy Collins. When prey escapes our ambush position, the hunt is usually over. We are not built for extended chases, and most prey animals can outrun us across level ground. Persistence hunting would be against our nature. Jake felt something click in his mind as he heard those words. He raised his hand before he fully realized what he was doing. The movement drew surprised looks from his classmates since he rarely participated in class discussions. What about persistence hunting? Jake asked as all eyes turned toward him. Professor. Velth's crystalline features shifted in confusion. Persistence hunting, the professor repeated slowly. I am not familiar with that term. Could you explain what you mean, Jake? Jake stood up, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. He had not planned to reveal this information, but something about Kresh's explanation had triggered a response he could not ignore. Persistence hunting is when a predator does not rely on speed or strength for the kill. Instead, they use endurance and determination to exhaust their prey. The classroom fell completely silent. Even the soft humming sounds that mollusk students usually made had stopped. Professor Velth leaned forward with obvious interest, while the herbivorous students looked confused and slightly disturbed by this new concept. How does such hunting work? Professor Velth asked. If a predator cannot catch prey through speed or force, what advantage do they gain through persistence? Jake took a deep breath and committed to the explanation. A persistence hunter tracks their target across vast distances, never stopping, never giving up until the prey animal collapses from exhaustion. The predator does not need to be faster than their prey, they just need to be more stubborn. Amy Collins made a sound of disbelief. That sounds ridiculous, she said with obvious contempt. What kind of pathetic predator is too weak to make a proper kill and has to torture their prey by chasing them until they die of tiredness? Jake turned to look directly at Amy, and his expression was calm but somehow unsettling. The kind of predator that became the dominant species on a death world. The implication of his words hit the classroom like a physical blow. Students who had dismissed Jake as harmless suddenly began to see him in a very different light. The quiet human in the back corner was not just another primitive Deathworlder. He was describing hunting strategies that his own species had perfected. Kresh stared at Jake with new understanding in his yellow eyes. Your people are persistence hunters, the Vorthak said, and it was not a question. Jake nodded slowly. Humans can run for hours without stopping. We can track wounded prey across continents. We can follow migrating herds for weeks until individual animals become too tired to keep up with the group. Then we move in for clean kills. Professor Velth was frantically taking notes on his crystal tablet. This is remarkable, he said. I have never heard of such a hunting strategy. How successful were human persistence hunters? Jake's smile was quiet but carried an edge that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. We hunted the megafauna of Earth to extinction. Woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, cave bears. We did not overpower them. We just never stopped following them until they could not run anymore. The classroom erupted in whispered conversations as students tried to process this information. The harmless human they had ignored for weeks had just revealed himself to be perhaps the most terrifying type of predator any of them could imagine. A hunter that never gave up was something beyond their worst nightmares, Amy Collins stared at. Jake, with wide eyes and pale green skin. For the first time since Kresh had joined the class, she seemed more afraid of the quiet human than the massive Vorthak who could tear her apart with his bare claws. The revelation about human persistence hunting had changed the atmosphere in xenobiology class completely. Students who once ignored Jake now watched him with nervous glances. Even Amy Collins had stopped making dismissive comments about Deathworlders, and seemed to go out of her way to avoid direct eye contact with the quiet human in the back corner. Professor Velf had spent the week after Jake's explanation researching persistence hunting, and announced that the class would participate in a practical exercise to better understand predator-prey relationships in natural environments. The Academy's vast wilderness preserve would serve as their laboratory for a multi-day ecosystem observation project. You will work in small groups to track and catalog various species behaviors across different biomes, Professor Velf explained as he distributed electronic tablets containing maps and assignment details. This exercise will help you understand how different hunting strategies affect ecosystem balance. Jake noticed that none of the herbivorous students volunteered to work with him when Professor Velf called for group formations. Even Kresh seemed uncertain about approaching the human who had revealed such disturbing information about his species. Jake did not mind working alone since he often performed better without having to worry about keeping up with hover platforms or electronic equipment that might malfunction. The wilderness preserve was enormous, covering several thousand square kilometers of carefully maintained natural habitats. Students spread out across the preserve using advanced sensors and hover platforms to observe wildlife from safe distances. The exercise was designed to last 3 days with emergency shelters and supply drops positioned throughout the area. Jake chose a section of dense forest where he could observe the interaction between various herbivore species and their environment. He set up his monitoring equipment and began the careful process of tracking animal movements through the underbrush. The work was peaceful and reminded him of camping trips he had taken on Earth. Before joining the academy, Kresh had paired with 2 nervous mollusk students who gradually seemed to warm up to his gentle nature. The big Vorthek was patient with their fears and made sure to explain his observations in ways that did not frighten them. Jake watched from a distance as Kresh demonstrated how to identify predator sign without actually disturbing the animals they were studying. Amy Collins had formed a group with several other Kaleri students, and they were using their hover platform to observe grazing animals in the grassland biome. Their advanced equipment allowed them to maintain what they considered a safe distance from any potentially dangerous wildlife, while still gathering the data required for their assignment. The first day passed without incident as students familiarized themselves with their assigned areas and began documenting animal behaviors. Jake found the work relaxing after weeks of sitting in classrooms surrounded by aliens who either feared or ignored him. In the wilderness, he could move at his own pace and use skills that felt natural rather than trying to adapt to alien technology. On the second day, everything changed when Amy's group encountered a serious problem. Their hover platform suffered a critical malfunction while they were observing animals deep in the forest biome. The antigrav units failed completely, leaving them stranded 30 kilometers from the nearest base camp with no way to call for immediate help. Amy activated her emergency beacon according to Academy protocols, but the response was delayed due to a severe storm system moving through the region. The rescue team estimated at least 6 hours before they could safely reach the stranded students. What made the situation worse was their location in territory known to be inhabited by Razorcrest PROWLARS. The Prowlers were pack hunters about the size of large Earth. Cats with bioluminescent stripes that pulsed when they were excited or aggressive. Academy safety briefings had specifically warned students to avoid prowler territory because the predators were known to attack groups of aliens who wandered into their hunting grounds. Jake received the emergency alert at his observation post, 15 kilometers away through rough terrain. Without hesitation, he abandoned his equipment and began running toward Amy's beacon signal. His steady, rhythmic pace carried him through dense underbrush, across rocky streams and up steep hillsides that would have challenged most alien species. Meanwhile, Kresh's group had also detected the emergency signal and the prowler pack moving toward Amy's position. Despite his own formidable abilities, Kresh knew that engaging 6 prowlers would be extremely dangerous even for a Vorthek. His mollusk companions were terrified at the thought of encountering the pack hunters, and their hover platform had also suffered damage that prevented rapid movement. Amy and her fellow Kaleri students huddled together near their disabled hover platform as darkness fell around them. They could hear the distinctive howling calls of Razorcrest prowlers echoing through the forest, and knew that the pack was closing in on their position. Their emergency flares provided some protection, but the supply was limited and would not last until rescue arrived. The first prowler appeared at the edge of their light circle just as Amy's group began to panic. The sleek predator's bioluminescent stripes pulsed with bright colors as it tested their defenses. Soon other pack members emerged from the darkness, forming a loose circle around the stranded students. Amy tried to stay calm as she had been trained, but fear made her hands shake as she prepared another flare. The prowlers were clearly intelligent hunters who understood that the light was keeping them at bay. They began testing different approaches and coordinating their movements in ways that suggested they were planning a coordinated attack. That was when Jake emerged from the tree line, moving with steady determination toward the standoff. Amy's group stared in shock as the human approached, apparently unarmed and alone. The prowlers turned their attention to this new arrival, and their predatory instincts immediately recognized another carnivore entering their territory. "Get back, Jake," Amy shouted despite her earlier fear of the human. "You cannot fight 6 prowlers by yourself. They will kill you." Jake did not respond to her warning. Instead, he picked up a sturdy branch from the forest floor and began walking directly toward the pack. The prowlers spread out in response, preparing to overwhelm this lone challenger with coordinated attacks from multiple directions. What happened next defied everything. Amy and her companions thought they knew about predator behavior. Jake did not charge forward or attempt a surprise attack like they expected. He did not try to intimidate the pack with loud noises or aggressive posturing. Instead, he simply began pursuing them with calm, relentless determination. When the first prowler lunged at him, Jake sidestepped the attack and struck the animal with his improvised weapon, but did not attempt to deliver a killing blow. The prowler retreated to regroup, and Jake followed. When other pack members tried to flank him, he shifted position to intercept them while maintaining pressure on the original attacker for over an hour. Jake maintained this pattern of pursuit and deflection. The prowlers grew increasingly frustrated as their coordinated hunting strategy failed against an opponent who refused to follow normal predator protocols. They were accustomed to quick, decisive encounters that ended with either victory or retreat. This human who just kept coming was something beyond their evolutionary experience. Amy watched in growing amazement as the pack hunters, who had terrorized her group, began to show signs of exhaustion. Their bioluminescent stripes started to fade. As their energy depleted, individual prowlers began to retreat deeper into the forest rather than continue the seemingly endless confrontation with a predator who never stopped pressing forward. By the time Kresh arrived with his mollusk companions, the prowler pack had completely withdrawn from the area. Jake stood calmly near Amy's position, barely breathing hard despite the extended chase. His improvised weapon was still in his hand, but he had not needed to seriously injure any of the animals to drive them away. Kresh approached with obvious respect showing in his massive frame. "Your people really are persistence hunters," the Vorthek said, and there was something like awe in his deep voice. Jake nodded and set down his branch. "We do not give up," he said simply. "Ever." The rescue team arrived to find Amy's group safe, but deeply shaken by what they had witnessed. Word of the incident spread quickly through the academy as students struggled to understand how a single unarmed human had driven off an entire pack of Razorcrest prowlers without killing any of them. The story grew with each telling until Jake became something of a legend among the student body. Amy Collins sat in the medical bay wrapped in a thermal blanket while academy healers checked her for signs of shock or injury. Her leaf green skin had returned to its normal color, but her large eyes still showed the fear and confusion she felt about the night's events. When Jake entered the medical bay to check on the rescued students, Amy looked up at him with an expression he had never seen before. "How did you do that?" Amy asked, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "You did not even kill them. You just made them leave by following them around. I do not understand how that is possible." Jake pulled up a chair and sat down across from Amy with his usual calm demeanor. "Persistence hunting is not about killing. Pray quickly," he explained. "It is about wearing them down until they cannot continue." The prowlers were expecting a normal predator encounter with clear winners and losers. When I refused to follow their rules, they did not know how to respond. Amy shook her head in disbelief. "But you are just one person against 6 trained hunters. They could have torn you apart if they had worked together properly." "Maybe," Jake admitted. "But that would have required them to stay and fight when every instinct was telling them to conserve energy and find easier prey. Persistence hunters succeed because we make ourselves too expensive to kill. Most predators will give up rather than waste energy on a target that refuses to quit." Kresh entered the medical bay and approached Jake with obvious respect in his massive frame. The big Vorthak had been quiet during the rescue operation, but his yellow eyes showed a new understanding of the human who had become his unlikely friend. "I've been thinking about what you did tonight," Kresh said, as he settled his bulk into a reinforced chair designed for larger species. "On my homeworld, we have stories about the old hunters who could track prey across continents, but I thought they were just legends." "Your people actually developed that capability," Jake nodded. "Humans evolved as endurance hunters on the African savanna. We could run down prey animals that were faster and stronger than us by simply refusing to give up the chase. Our ancestors hunted woolly mammoths and giant ground sloths to extinction using nothing but persistence and basic tools." Amy listened to this explanation with growing horror. "You mean your species deliberately hunted other animals until they died of exhaustion?" she said. "That sounds like torture rather than hunting." "Nature does not care about our opinions on what is cruel or merciful," Jake replied. "Evolution shaped humans to be persistence hunters because that strategy worked for millions of years. We became the dominant species on Earth by outlasting everything else." Professor Velth arrived at the medical bay, carrying several data tablets and looking more excited than anyone had ever seen the crystalline being. "Jake, I have been researching your species since the incident report came in," the professor said with his wind chime voice. "The implications of human hunting adaptations are extraordinary." Jake noticed that other students had begun gathering outside the medical bay to listen to the conversation. News of the prowler encounter had drawn attention from across the academy, and everyone wanted to understand how the quiet human had accomplished something that seemed impossible. "What did you find, Professor?" Amy asked, though she looked like she was not sure she wanted to hear the answer. Professor Velth activated one of his tablets and projected holographic data into the air above them. "Human persistence hunting represents one of the most successful predatory strategies in galactic natural history," he explained. "Your species developed the ability to track wounded prey for days or weeks until the animals collapsed from blood loss and exhaustion. The holographic display showed migration patterns of Earth's extinct megafauna overlaid with human settlement data. The correlation was unmistakable as human populations expanded. The large animal species disappeared with mathematical precision. Woolly mammoths survived ice ages and climate changes for hundreds of thousands of years," Professor Velth continued. "But they went extinct within a few thousand years of encountering human hunters. The same pattern repeated with giant ground sloths, cave bears, and dozens of other megafauna species." Amy stared at the data with wide eyes. "Your people hunted all those animals to extinction just by following them until they died," she said. "How is that even possible?" "Human endurance capabilities are far beyond galactic norms," Professor Velth explained. "Your species can maintain steady running pace for hours while most animals can only sprint for short distances. Humans also have sophisticated tracking abilities and can follow wounded prey across vast territories." Jake felt uncomfortable being the center of so much attention, but he continued to answer questions about human hunting heritage. "Our ancestors would wound a large animal with spears, then follow the blood trail for days or weeks," he said. "The injured animal would eventually collapse from blood loss and exhaustion. Then the hunters would move in for a clean kill. Kresh made a sound that might have been admiration. That explains why Earth is classified as a death world, the Vorthek sighed. Most species assume dangerous planets are hostile because of environmental factors. They do not realize that sometimes the environment is dangerous because of what evolved there. Professor Velth nodded enthusiastically. Exactly correct. Kresh, human persistence hunting capabilities make them perhaps the most successful predatory species in known galactic history. Yet most aliens dismiss them as primitive because they do not recognize the signs of an apex predator. Amy looked between Jake and Kresh with new understanding dawning in her large eyes. You're both predators, but in completely different ways, she said slowly. Kresh is obviously dangerous because of his size and claws, but Jake is dangerous because he never stops. That is why the Prowlers ran away. They recognized something that scared them more than physical threat. Jake smiled grimly. Fear of the unknown is a powerful survival instinct, he said. The Prowlers understood pack hunting and territorial disputes, but they had never encountered a predator that just kept coming no matter what they did. That kind of relentless pursuit is outside their evolutionary experience. As the conversation continued, more students gathered to listen. The herbivorous aliens who had dismissed Jake as harmless now looked at him with the same nervous respect they showed. Kresh, the quiet human in the back corner, had revealed himself to be something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Professor Velth announced that he would be revising the xenobiology curriculum to include comprehensive coverage of persistence hunting strategies. The Academy's database would be updated to properly classify human predatory adaptations alongside other apex hunting species. In the days that followed, Jake found himself approached by students who wanted to understand more about human capabilities. Amy Collins publicly apologized for her earlier prejudice and asked Jake to share his knowledge of Earth ecosystems with the class. Even the nervous mollusk students began to show interest in learning about different types of predatory behavior. Kresh and Jake developed a strong friendship based on their shared understanding of predatory responsibility. Despite their different hunting strategies, both species recognized the importance of respecting prey animals and maintaining ecosystem balance. Jake's final presentation to the class was simple but profound. Every species evolves survival strategies suited to their environment, he explained while standing before his classmates. Vorthek developed strength and speed for quick, decisive hunts. Humans developed endurance and intelligence for long-term pursuit. Both approaches created successful apex predators, but the galaxy only feared the obvious one. As the semester ended, Jake reflected on the lessons everyone had learned about assumptions and appearances. The most intimidating predator in the class had turned out to be the gentlest student, while the dismissed Deathworlder had revealed himself to be perhaps the most persistent hunter any of them would ever encounter. The herbivorous students had learned that judging species based on diet or appearance could lead to dangerous misconceptions. Kresh had found acceptance among classmates who finally understood that being a predator did not automatically make someone violent or cruel. Jake had discovered that sometimes revealing the truth about human nature was the best way to earn genuine respect rather than fearful dismissal. Most importantly, the entire class had gained a deeper appreciation for the complex relationships between predators and prey that shaped ecosystems across the galaxy. They learned that successful hunters came in many forms and that the most dangerous predator was not always the one that looked most threatening. The galaxy had gained new respect for the quiet persistence of humanity, and a better understanding of why Earth truly deserved its classification as a death world.